And over time, rabbinic tradition associated the name of Shavuot with the giving of the Torah, although it seems to me that it doesn't explicitly appear anywhere in the Tanakh that Shavuot is the time when the Torah was given. On Sinai, that's not true.
You're right that it's not explicitly written that the Torah was given on Shavuot. As I was telling you, Shavuot is a festival that talks about agricultural themes, as you pointed out, about the harvest, about Exodus 23, about the first fruits, as I mentioned to you, Numbers 28. But in Judaism, as you pointed out, we do consider that there is a connection between the festival of Shavuot and the giving of the Torah. This is mentioned in the Talmud, that the Torah was given on the festival of Atzeret. This is in the tractate Pesakim. We say it several times in our liturgy. This has been found, for example, in documentation from the Genizot, such as the Cairo Geniza, the Sidur of Amal Gaon, that is very ancient sources. However, I wouldn't say it's a rabbinic interpretation, what in my opinion is misleadingly called rabbinic Judaism. Judaism is rabbinic by definition at this moment.
So,
The connection between Shavuot and the giving of the Torah already has a precedent. For example, in the book of Jubilees, a connection is made between Shavuot and the idea of the covenant. And the giving of the Torah is one of the covenants presented in the book of Jubilees. The book of Jubilees, for those who are not familiar, is a book that was not included in the biblical canon, but is considered an apocryphal book, meaning it is outside the canon. But it is a book that had a strong presence in the ancient world, so much so that even in the Qumran schools, fragments of this book have been found. That is to say, it was highly regarded by many circles of Judaism at that time. And in the book of Jubilees, several covenants are mentioned. The covenant of Abraham, of Yaakov, the Noahide covenant, which discusses that topic somewhere around chapters 7 and 6. And well, with Abraham in chapter 15, with Yaakov in chapter 44, the theme of Shavuot is repeated several times. Every time it is related to covenants. That is to say, there really was this notion of a Sinaitic covenant, because Jubilees primarily deals with the covenant of the Torah itself, related to the concept of weeks, which is also one of the main themes in Jubilees. So there is already a precedent. This has also been found, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where it is written that there are community rules, for those who know them. In a Qumran community rule, it talks about a kind of covenant renewal ceremony in the third month. And there are some scholars who suggest that this is Shavuot, that it is a reference to Shavuot. So we can see that beyond what we might say is an innovation of Rabbinic Judaism, trying to connect Shavuot with the giving of the Torah. Actually, if we refer to very old documentation from other Jewish circles of the time, we can see that it is not necessary. Not just an interpretation by the rabbis, but rather the continuation of a tradition in the Talmud. There is a discussion about how the Torah was given. This is in the Tractate Gittin, and the discussion is rabbinic. He says that it was given scroll by scroll, megillot, something like the documentary hypothesis. Osvaldo, if you remember, we made a video about that topic, and it's an opinion. Another opinion is that the Torah was given complete, just as we have it today. What is called the Pentateuch, but which is the Torah. That is, when we say that the Torah was given, it does not refer to the scroll as we know it today, because the text of the Torah includes the stories, like from creation until the death of Moshe. For example, does it make sense that Moshe, while at Sinai, received a book that contains his own death and events that have not yet happened in the course of the Exodus? And all of this, therefore, when we talk about the giving of the Torah, it's the oral Torah, not the written Torah. Does this development involve Israel throughout the process? So, to your specific question, if we understand this academic evidence that has shown us that there is already a link between the concept of Shavuot and the concept of the covenant of giving the Torah, and all of this, we would no longer be talking so much about a rabbinic interpretation of tradition, but rather that we Jews are the continuation of an ancient tradition. And we are simply replicating what was passed down to us up to this day, which was recorded in our literature, basically because of that.
well, on the other hand, if we consider that the Greek word Pentecost, as we said, basically means 50, that is, it refers to the counting of 50 days from the Feast of Matzot, in an article by some scholars from the University of Oxford, it tells us that the term Pentecost or Shavuot was common among Jewish communities, such as those who spoke Greek, as reflected in texts prior to Paul, such as the texts of Tobit and Second Maccabees. So, when Paul casually mentions the plan to celebrate Shavuot in Ephesus in 1 Corinthians, it seems to assume that this festival was already part of the liturgical cycle of the early Christians. From your perspective as a rabbi, how do you interpret the fact that this continuity with the Hellenistic Jewish calendar helped Paul to integrate non-Jewish believers in a community that, although it was new, preserved the shared festive roots? How do you see it?
What do you think? Interesting question. I believe that Christianity does not share festivals with the Jews, not even in Paul's time. By the second generation of Christians, there was already the stance of, what's the term, antinomian, you could say, like being against the law. There were groups, it's true, like the Ebionites, who were Christian groups that leaned more toward following the law, but they were not Pauline at all. In fact, they had very harsh criticism of Paul's positions. Paul does not intend for his followers of his new religion to follow Jewish law. There are several ways to explain that, but in my reading of the subject, Paul had a strategy that it seems to me was very deliberate of appropriation of the theological structure of Judaism. And what he did was use the elements that were known in Jewish memory, but he redefined them. For example, when he talks about the covenant, when he talks about revelation, he doesn't use the conventional meanings that you see in the Jewish literature of his time. He adapts these, let's say, Jewish terminologies to what is a new religious concept. So I don't think that, let's say, with Paul, you could talk about a shared root. It's true that the term Shavuot is shared, but I don't think that just because the term is shared, it means it's the same concept. This happens with many ideas, like we share the word Messiah, but we have very different concepts of what the Messiah represents. Okay, to take it a step further, because I liked what you mentioned about the other literatures where Shavuot is mentioned, the counting that we Jews still do to this day leading up to Shavuot, that is when Shavuot falls. We count from the night of Pesach after the first night of the festival called Passover until the festival of unleavened bread. That is, we count 7 weeks, and then one more day is Shavuot, 50 days. That's why, as we said before, it's called Pentecost, because it's the 50th. This, the counting I just told you about, appears in the Talmud, in many parts of Jewish literature, in the Zifr, and in some of the oldest sources of what is known as the Pharisaic tradition. This same counting style is also used for Shavuot. For example, Flavius Josephus uses this method too. Philo of Alexandria, he also mentions this way of counting. Philo of Alexandria is in a Hellenistic context. He counted 50 days from Pesach, but there were other groups that had a different way of counting to reach Shavuot. That is to say, there wasn't a uniform observance of Shavuot, it seems, in this era, because there were different ways of counting how to reach Shavuot. For example, how do we know that Shavuot? How do we Jews understand that Shavuot is the 50th day? Because in the Pasuk, in the verse, it says that you count from Shavuot. We consider that Shavuot refers to the first day of Pesach, and from there we start counting. But there were other forms of Judaism at that time that when Shavuot is written in the Torah, they took it literally. So, for example, when Pesach began, the first Shavuot of Pesach is when you started counting. That's why Pentecost would always be on a Sunday. Because if you start counting from a Saturday, 50 days later, it will always be a Sunday. That's why for many other Jewish groups of that time, Shavuot was always on a Sunday. I'm saying this deliberately because it may sound familiar to a Christian audience that Pentecost falls on a Sunday and that the counting works that way. We see that the roots, that's why they differ from the way Judaism counts in what continued to be orthodoxy. Not to be confused with modern orthodoxy, but with the line that was inherited from Judaism until today, the line that survived. The groups that counted this way included, for example, those at Qumran, who may have been Essenes. There is some debate about whether or to what extent the people at Qumran were Essenes anyway. And the Sadducees had another way of counting Shavuot. They also said that Shavuot should always fall on a Sunday. This is written in Megillat Ta'anit, Sunday in modern terms, Yom Rishon, the first day of the week. Nowadays, those who also keep this way of counting are the Karaites. The Samaritans use this way of counting. That is, we see that it was different. That's why I don't know if Paul shared the same conceptualization in his theological interests. I don't think so. In his interests or his temporal heritage. I'm not sure because I'm one of those who believe that Jesus had a great Essene influence. Although he was not an Essene, I think he was indeed influenced by what was part of the Essene school. I believe we talked about that at some point as well. By the way, yes, when we talked about the topic of Hanukkah, but I have a video about that on my page, Jewish Philosophy, for anyone who wants to watch it. Jesus the Essene, something like that. That's why it wouldn't be strange for this new, let's say, Christian sect, which arose from Jesus and later reinterpreted by Paul. It might have celebrated Shavuot differently. Now, it's true that Paul, he had Hellenistic influence. We see, for example, Philo of Alexandria, he had the regular Jewish counting of Shavuot, normal. The quotes you mentioned, for example, 2nd Maccabees chapter 12, there it talks about Shavuot. The context there in this chapter, it talks about military campaigns that were led by Judah Maccabee. It talks about battles, about war strategies. And this tells us that when Shavuot is mentioned there, it points out, it says Feast of Weeks, literally, when it says Feast of Weeks. It's the literal translation of the word Shavuot, weeks. That means this festival was already part of the national Jewish calendar, even in times of war. That's the context there. You also mentioned the reference from the book of Tobit, Tobias. There, the term Pentecost is mentioned. That means it's already moving more into the Greek world, and it already has foreign influence. We know that. The book of Tobit was also considered apocryphal and all that. There, in that, when Pentecost is mentioned in Tobit, it talks about a banquet they are having. In other words, broadly speaking, the concept of Shavuot was known in the Jewish world. That's why I'm telling you that what Paul does is that he turns to the central motifs of Judaism. He refers to the central dates of Judaism, and he reinterprets them. He changes them, so to speak. In other words, what he's trying to do is prevent his new followers from his group from approaching the concepts of Judaism as such. There are many ways to explain this, but not to go on too long. What I could say, let's say, is that it has a lot to do with it. It's what you said. Paul added new people to his congregation on the day of Pentecost and all of this. In fact, there is a precedent for this in Judaism. In Judaism, we consider that Shavuot has a strong connection with converts to Judaism, with proselytes. And we read this in what is known as Megillat Ruth. This is the book of Ruth. There is a connection. And in Jewish tradition, Ruth, the Moabite, she converts. She becomes part of Judaism. She joins the Jewish people. That is conversion. And that's why maybe there is a conceptual precedent for doing this, for adding people to your religion on Pentecost, let's say, or to your group. Another aspect that you mentioned on the slide, it's the pilgrimage of Shavuot to Jerusalem. This is seen in Acts chapter 2, where you can see that it's a scene where they go to Jerusalem, and all of this happens during the festival of Pentecost on Shavuot. And it's described that there are people from many nations, and in fact, that's where they start speaking in tongues. So it's not clear if it's that they started saying things in another language, like something different, like gibberish, I don't know what to call it, or if they spoke in the languages of the people who were there from different countries. By the way, Paul criticizes this practice of speaking in tongues and all that, just as a fun fact in 1 Corinthians 14 anyway. What we can see is that, yes, there is a connection between the nations and their connection with Judaism. But what I think Paul does is use Jewish vocabulary, and then he gives it a new meaning. So that's why I think that even though we supposedly share the name Shavuot versus Pentecost, from my perspective, the concepts have been very different since Paul's time.
That point of view in Catholic and Orthodox theology. Pentecost denotes the Paschal fulfillment when the Spirit descends to encourage the disciples for the universal mission. The Roman liturgy, for example, places this 50 days after Easter Sunday, celebrating it with biblical readings that focus on fire, wind, and creation, the gift of the law, uniting the themes of testamentary acts and perspectives, neo, of the New Testament. En ese sentido, what do you think about it?
That's where it differs so much, because as I was saying, there's really no conceptual link between Shavuot and the Christian Pentecost. Because, for example, Passover, what do they celebrate at Passover? They don't celebrate it as a church. What about national matters? And all of this, like Pesach, Pascua, ellos celebran una resurrección. then Ascension Day, which is what they celebrate based on Acts chapter 1, all of this. And then in the Catholic order, what follows is Pesach, Pentecost. And what they celebrate is not the agricultural Shavuot. It's not a Shavuot of a national character. Judaism, what they celebrate is that the disciples received the gift of the Holy Spirit. So it has nothing to do with that. I think that's why the concept of Pentecost in Christianity and the idea of Shavuot are basically irreconcilable. That's why I don't think it's worth trying to force that connection.
On the other hand, considering that Jesus, as a Jew of the first century, but always putting it in that context, at that time he lived under the precepts of the Torah, according to what the Gospels tell us. And he participated in festivals like Pesach, and even scholars have that position. People like Antonio Piñera say that Jesus celebrated all the festivals of his time, like Pesach, with his group, for example. However, there is no explicit account that he celebrated Shavuot. And so, what historical and textual elements would lead you to affirm or question whether Yeshua, in his original context, in that Jewish context of the time, would have actually observed Shavuot?
In terms of historical and textual elements, if one wants to affirm that Yeshua celebrated Shavuot, I imagine that one would look at the context of the time. Would it make sense that in one way or another Yeshua had any experience of Shavuot at some point in his life? As we mentioned earlier, Shavuot was highly accepted. It was mentioned by the Essenes, by Philo of Alexandria, the Book of Tobit, and 2nd Maccabees. It was a well-known festival, so it makes sense that Yeshua knew about Shavuot and that at some point in his life he interacted with this festival. But I wouldn't take for granted the case of Yeshua when he was already, let's say, more settled in his views. The statement you made that Yeshua lived under the precepts of the Torah, I would question that. Setting aside and without going too deep into it, what do I mean by that? But the quotes that mention that Yeshua celebrated Pesach, that he celebrated Sukkot, for example, in the Gospel of John, that's not exactly what John says. What John says is that, for example, it was the time of Sukkot, it was the season of Sukkot. It doesn't explicitly say Yeshua celebrated Sukkot, only that he was present. If you actually pay attention to John's language, he speaks as if the Jews were something foreign to John. It's like the Jews did this and that. In other words, the Jews as if they were third parties, and that's something foreign to the evangelist. It's a detail that can't be overlooked because it's precisely in these kinds of mentions that the synoptic gospels also make these kinds of mentions. So let's say, not to be too hard on John, we can see that there are cases where Jesus does not follow what is stipulated in the feasts. For example, what did you say about Passover? The gospels explicitly say that it was the feast of unleavened bread. Unleavened bread is matzah. But then Jesus is shown eating bread artos in Greek, and he is eating bread during Passover. That is, just because John tells you it was the feast of Sukkot doesn't mean that the Jesus of the Gospels celebrated Sukkot. And theologically, by the way, many Christians agree with this. They believe that Jesus came to fulfill the law in his death. There are many such interpretations among Christian groups. So is that why for the Jesus of the Gospels, the Torah's prohibitions no longer apply? It doesn't bother them because there's an antinomian view that Jesus opposes the law, having established a new covenant. And all this narrative, for example, that Jesus is supposedly the Lord of the Sabbath, and that's why he can profane the Sabbath. So, in the textual aspect, that would be it. In the historical aspect, as I said, the context is the gospel, and what law, the one in the gospels, if any, I had the honor that you invited me. And if you haven't seen the video, it will be shared in the description. But there I mentioned to you that it could be that Jesus never celebrated Hanukkah. Because of the dispute between the Maccabees and the Essenes and their criticism of the temple, all of this was discussed in the video. But that's why even though the Gospel of John mentions that it was the Feast of Dedication, it doesn't mean that Jesus took part in the Feast of Dedication, that is Hanukkah. So is that why even if it tells you it's the Feast of Sukkot, it can be interpreted in one way or another? That's right, if the Gospels are our historical source for understanding Jesus. Now, another thing to analyze is that according to the Torah, Shavuot is actually a festival that is celebrated by making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. That's what the Torah stipulates. Paul, even in one of his letters that you mentioned, he says that he would be in Ephesus. Until when? Until Shavuot. That is like, well, and what is he going to do? When Shavuot arrives, he's going to leave Ephesus. Where is he going to go? Acts of the Apostles says that he was in a hurry to be in Jerusalem during Shavuot. That's in Acts chapter 20. So even Paul in Acts of the Apostles wants to make the pilgrimage. But with Jesus, we don't know if he ever made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. There are only 2 occasions where his stay in Jerusalem is mentioned at the beginning of Luke. That's because he was a child and his parents took him there and he got lost and was found at the temple. And that was during Passover, not for Shavuot. Passover is 50 days before Shavuot, unless he stayed 50 days in Jerusalem, something I highly doubt given the conditions of that time. The second time Yeshua goes to Jerusalem is at the end of his life, in the last week of his life, which was also Passover, so he didn't make it to Shavuot. That's why I would say that, strictly speaking, if we use the same standard as these scholars, whom I respect a lot, by the way, I think they are people with brilliant minds. If the standard we're using for information is the New Testament, I find it very strange that this wasn't mentioned. We're talking about a teacher of the law. Supposedly, his only pilgrimage to Jerusalem was at the age of 30. So here's one of the possible explanations for this. How is it possible that he didn't make a pilgrimage on Shavuot? He didn't observe Shavuot, so maybe it's because he was opposed to the Jerusalem temple? I don't know, maybe this is really just speculation, what I'm saying about Yeshua having one. He had an Essene one, and the Essenes, as we already know, had a very strong conflict with the priesthood of Jerusalem. Maybe it was because he was opposed to what was happening in the temple and all that then. That's why, broadly speaking, I don't think we necessarily have to believe that Jesus celebrated this or that. Just because the Gospel of John mentions it as the context of the time. Let's remember that Jesus comes with a message very different from that of his time. He truly comes to break major paradigms. That's why it wouldn't be too far-fetched to think that he also came to challenge the idea of Shavuot. So wouldn't he observe it then? And this is a bit anachronistic, what I'm going to say, but it's like Shabbatai Zvi, who was already a character. Much later, he was a false messiah. And all this, he presented himself as the Mashiach, and he simultaneously profaned the laws of the Torah in public. He would go to the squares and violate the Shabbat in public, and all this. And he did that on the grounds that he was the Mashiach, and that he was coming with a new Torah and all this. Obviously, his project failed. He became Muslim, and all this, yes, by force. So that's why I think we couldn't necessarily conclude that Jesus celebrated Shavuot like the groups of his time, since he had his own way of seeing these kinds of things. So that's what I believe.
Well, dear friend Jacob, our time is up. It has been very interesting, and as usual, I am left with more questions than answers.
Pues Osvaldo, gracias por la invitación. Honestly, I feel tiny next to the great minds you have on this channel. That's why I highly recommend the content you promote. Because you made a high standard of knowledge accessible on a platform everyone can use. And I thank you for allowing me to participate.
The endless gratitude is mine, Jacob. It's an honor to have you on my channel, and I always appreciate your willingness to take every question seriously and rigorously. So thank you very much, and I send a big hug to Israel and all its people. Stay strong.